Hello there, and today I've got a weirder build that uses a bunch of different tools to truly live the invader dream of spamming Wormhole and spawning shadows everywhere. But first, just a disclaimer, this is not like a clickbait, OP, crazy build. I've already covered most of the builds that I consider the strongest, and this one really is not competitive at all with something like the Starshot Energized Neck Coil build, while also being much more demanding to play. I just wanted to share something kind of different that lets you spam invader skills liberally while having it as the prime archetype to really make the shadows a regular part of the gameplay loop. So without further ado, we can talk about the build, and I'm going to start by demonstrating the combat loop we're going for before explaining how it works. So the goal here is to use Deceit's Ouroboros mod, then cast Wormhole, and then melee to fire off the swords. And the true prize here is having this loop with itself infinitely. Since Deceit's mod costs so much mod power, we can use Spellweaver, and with enough cooldown reduction, we'll be able to refund an entire Wormhole charge with each cast. So then our next problem to solve is getting almost 1300 mod power out of a single charged melee, and that's going to require a little more creative solution. And that ends up being One True King Sigil combined with Phelan's Sigil, Arcane Strike, and Spirit. Phelan's Sigil is not like other sources of mod power generation. Its mod power generation for melee damage is based on the final damage value and not just the base damage. This means it generates more mod power based on increases to your melee damage, and if you crit or hit weak spots, you'll generate even more mod power on top of that. Furthermore, the damage from Deceit's mod when you throw the blades, these also count as melee damage, so the thrown blades will also generate mod power, and this is actually where the majority of our damage and mod power comes from. The blades do have travel time, so it is possible to miss, but the shadows from Invader's Prime perk have extremely high aggro generation, so it's usually fairly easy to land these while enemies are stuck attacking your shadows after you Wormhole. The final piece of the puzzle is the Opportunist mutator on our melee, which activates on every Wormhole cast since it counts as a perfect dodge, and this guarantees crits on melee attacks for 2 seconds, which is also refreshed on dodge. And since Ouroboros counts as melee damage, it's also guaranteed to crit while Opportunist is active, and since Phelan's Sigil generates mod power using final damage values, this 1.85x damage and mod power generation increase is enough to fully refund Deceit's mod just by throwing the blades. So now that you understand the general concept, we can get into the details. We've got Invader Prime because that's kind of the point of this build, and Archon is our secondary with Chaos Gate for the help to mod power economy, plus just all of the damage boosts help increase the damage of Ouroboros and your secondary mod of choice. The first real point of discussion is the choice of melee weapon. Realistically, you have 6 options here, but in my opinion, one of them clearly outshines the rest. Since we're building around throwing Deceit's blades and we're getting all of our mod power for melee damage, we want a projectile melee to make this play more naturally, while also letting us generate mod power at a distance if our skill loop gets interrupted. And with this in mind, we can immediately narrow down our choices to the Krell Axe, Huntress Spear, Atom Splitter, World's Edge, Crystal Staff, and the Hero's Sword. I'm immediately going to disqualify the Crystal Staff, World's Edge, and Atom Splitter because they're just inferior to the Hero's Sword for our purposes, being much slower or clunkier to use, especially the Atom Splitter, which requires a backstep melee, and the Crystal Staff, which needs to be charged up. Between the remaining 3 choices, the key difference here is between the thrown melees and the Hero's Sword. So when you use the Oops. So when you use Ouroboros with a thrown melee weapon, like the Huntress Spear, you'll notice that the melee is always going to hit first because Ouroboros doesn't fire off until you've already thrown the melee. So when you do this, what ends up happening is that your melee is going to consume Wormholes damage boost instead of Ouroboros. Compare this to when we use the Hero's Sword. You're going to see that Ouroboros hits first and gets the massive damage boost. And since Ouroboros has 450 base damage compared to any of these thrown melees, which have under 200, we're going to get a lot more damage by using the Hero's Sword, since Ouroboros is going to connect first and get the damage boost. Next is skill cooldowns. I haven't actually measured Spellweaver's skill cooldown because I hate timing things, but it's clearly related to the skill's base cooldown and not the actual cooldown after stats apply, since the percentage of your skill that you get back is way higher with more cooldown reduction. But I also did the math myself for how much it should be refunding with these stats, and Spellweaver is still refunding way more than expected, so I'm not going to make any statements as to the specifics of how it works. Either way, though, after some testing, I found the sweet spot here to be 65% skill cooldown reduction, which we're getting through Burden of the Rebel, Black Pawn Stamp, our traits, the skill cooldown, fragment, and the Xenoplasm consumable. Between casting the mod and the time it takes to use a charge melee, this gets you infinite wormholes, although the loop is pretty delicate on the mod power generation side, like between the mod power and skill cooldown aspects of it, and changing things just a little bit is going to ruin the loop. For example, just slotting a mod cost reduction fragment is going to lower the amount of skill cooldown refund from Deceit, from casting Spellweaver with Deceit, and that's actually going to break your loop and make this build not function after a couple rotations. Another important thing I haven't touched on yet is the handgun slot. Not using Nebula here is very intentional for a couple of reasons. First is that Nebula's mod is currently considered range damage, so it'll waste your wormhole damage boost every time and just breaks this build entirely. Second is that it really doesn't synergize with this build very well. We're generating a ridiculous amount of mod power, so using mods with an active duration that prevent mod power generation is a gigantic waste. And since all of our mod power is coming from melee damage, we're giving it to both of our weapons at the same time. Our main loop is also very APM intensive, and you're pressing a lot of buttons, and it doesn't leave much time to do much else. So we want an expensive high damage mod that we can throw out basically whenever to sink all of the mod power that we generate and turn it into more damage. Therefore, the best options are Firestorm or Starshot, and you can pick between them based on personal preference. Personally, I tend to lean more towards Firestorm to cover for this build's lacking ad clear, since you need to combo Wormhole plus Ouroboros for the main damage loop, and that just really is not viable against a bunch of ads. I like to run Pressure Point as the mutator here for an extra 1.7k damage if I cast in point blank range, although you can also just go failsafe for more damage. We're completely overflowing with mod power, so feedback is just unnecessary. To quickly go over everything else, I've got Tranquil Heart here for the relic since our base damage is actually quite low, making Lifesteal relatively ineffective. And aside from the skill cooldown fragment, we've got melee crit damage to further boost our guaranteed Ouroboros crits alongside probability cord. And we've also got melee speed to just make things flow a little smoother. You can swap that out for something like mod damage or charge melee stamina consumption if you don't find it helpful, but I personally really like the extra bit of speed. For the traits, we're obviously going all in on skill cooldown and mod power generation. And I'm going to highly recommend also taking points in endurance and recovery, as well as staying at a light load if possible. There's very little downtime with this build, and you have enough to pay attention to that being able to mostly ignore stamina problems is a big help. Otherwise, though, there isn't much to mention here. Finally, some notes on gameplay, since this build is far more involved to actually play than anything else that I've shown off. So first, it's very important to use charged melee to fire off Deceit's blades here, since this ends the mod's duration instantly and allows the thrown blades to generate mod power via Phelan Sigil. If you throw them one by one, none of them generate mod power because the mod is still active, and you won't be able to do this build's loop. So if you do this, none of these generated any mod power. It's also important to have a plan to recover if something goes wrong, like maybe the boss teleports or dodges before Deceit's blades connect, or you just miss and now you're out of mod power. In this case, what you want to do is just wormhole and do backstep melees. Backsteps reset the duration of Opportunist to guarantee crits, and with Phelan Sigil, you're going to refill Deceit in just 3 hits. The most important thing to keep in mind here, though, is just to be careful and watch where you're teleporting to with Wormhole. And generally, you want to avoid teleporting into melee range, because the orbiting blades from Ouroboros also count as melee damage, and they're going to consume your Wormhole damage bonus, which breaks the skill loop. Like this. Barely get any mod power out of that. You also need to be able to make sure that you're teleporting to a good spot so you can fire off the blades immediately after teleporting, because you need them to hit while Opportunist is still active to guarantee that they crit. Like I said at the start, most other builds I've shown are designed to give you maximum output for minimum effort, but this is really not one of them. To close out, I just want to make sure that I give a clear warning that this build does not work against every boss. Bosses like Venom that take greatly reduced damage if you don't hit them in a specific place are just the worst, since you can only do so much to aim the Ouroboros blades, and them doing reduced damage means that you're not going to generate enough mod power to refund your mod, and the skill loop is not going to work at all. While this setup generally does enough damage to be viable on Apocalypse, just make sure you're not deciding to use it because you think it's crazy OP, most broken build in the game, S+++ tier. You really just use this when you want to play up the invader fantasy to the max, teleporting all over the place and bamboozling enemies with shadows. Personally, I find it a lot of fun to play, and if it looks like it's worth the effort to you, then give it a try. Enjoy.